In this video, we will walk through completing the worksheet to calculate the pastor's next year gross compensation for a pastor living in a church-provided parsonage and the associated SECA tax reimbursement. In my example, I am using 2019 as the next year. I recommend that you have access to or have reviewed the following before beginning the gross compensation worksheet. Have a copy of the blank gross compensation worksheet, the 2019 Pastoral Compensation Instructions, and the example of a completed gross compensation worksheet. This video is only completing the worksheet. I will not be going into detail explaining the components of pastoral compensation. Please see the explanation of pastoral compensation video for a pastor residing in a church-provided parsonage for a detailed discussion of pastoral compensation. Let me first start with that the previous pastoral compensation forms were correct and accurate in their content. Most of the questions I have received on pastoral compensation could have been answered if the forms were actually completed. The new forms are mostly a reformatting of the old forms and contain most of the same information and calculations. The big difference between the old and the new forms is that the different housing situations of home ownership versus living in a parsonage have been separated into two different sets of forms, and we're using some new terminology. This has created an overall increase in the number of forms, but I hope the new forms have been simplified and easier to complete. Okay, let's get into the gross compensation worksheet. First, we start with the church name. Then we include the pastor's name. Then the clergy classification. The clergy classification can be found in the National Conference Journal in Section 1, kind of towards the back. Hours worked per week. It is important to record an accurate hours worked per week. Anything less than 40 hours per week is considered part-time. A proper designation between full-time and part-time is necessary for the correct payment of employee benefits. For my example, Pastor Joe B. Cole is a full-time pastor. Now, find your pastor's 2018 gross compensation, either from the church's approved budget or from last year's pastoral compensation forms. Last year, the term gross compensation was not used. However, it is comprised of cash salary plus parsonage furnishings allowance. The suggested minimum salary increase is normally expressed as a percentage increase. In my example, I am using 1.5%. Also, Pastor Joe is doing a great job, and the PRC is recommending an annual increase of $300 per year. This could be expressed as an additional percentage increase or as a dollar increase. In my example, I'm using a dollar increase. I calculate the total annual increase. For this calculation, we use the 2018 gross compensation of $28,500 multiplied by the 1.5% increase equals $427.50. Then we add the additional dollar amount increase of $300, which gives us $727.50 of an annual increase for Pastor Joe. We add the annual increase of $727.50 to the 2018 gross compensation to get the 2019 gross compensation of $29,227.50. In my example, I am rounding up to the next whole dollar of $29,228. This is not required, but it is a personal preference on my part. Now we will calculate the SECA tax reimbursement. Start with the 2019 gross compensation calculated earlier of $29,228. For a pastor in a parsonage, the parsonage rental value is added to the gross compensation. The parsonage rental value includes the value of utilities and maintenance supplied by the church. An in-depth discussion of parsonage rental value was discussed in the components of basic pastoral compensation video. Any payroll deductions that are healthcare related are exempt for the SECA tax. For the EC Church, the only healthcare related withholdings are currently if the pastor contributes an amount towards their health insurance premium and makes voluntary flex spending account contributions. In my example, Pastor Joe is contributing towards the health insurance and making a contribution to his flex spending account. Completing the math, gross compensation plus parsonage rental value less health insurance premium contribution less flex spending contribution equals the SECA taxable income. Now we multiply the SECA taxable income by the 7.65% to calculate the amount of SECA tax reimbursement to be paid to Pastor Joe as regular wages. Again, I personally prefer to round up or down to the nearest whole dollar. Please be aware that the parsonage rental value and parsonage furnishings allowance are two different numbers. While both amounts are taxable for the SECA tax, but for other payroll taxes, they have different taxability rules. View the pastoral compensation for a pastor residing in a church-provided parsonage video for a detailed discussion of the differences between the parsonage furnishings allowance and the parsonage rental value. Also, on the 2019 Pastoral Compensation Instructions, I have a list of needed information and amounts that will make this task easier if you have that information in advance. Unfortunately, the information needed for pastoral compensation comes from multiple sources that are unrelated and not always available at the same time. Pastoral compensation is what it is. The information will be released when it is available, and please take your time and do a thorough and complete job, which is always better for the pastor and the church.